She had exactly 47 minutes before the CEO walked through those glass doors, and her supervisor's voice still echoed in her ears. "Clean the boardroom, make it spotless. The executive team is arriving at 2 p.m. Maya checked her watch, 1:13 p.m., and pushed the cleaning cart through the pristine corridor of Meridian Financial's 42nd floor. Her first day as an intern, her first real test. She was 22, fresh out of community college, with an associate's degree in business administration, and terrified of getting anything wrong. The boardroom door slid open silently, revealing the long mahogany table that dominated the space, surrounded by 20 ergonomic chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed Manhattan's skyline like a framed masterpiece. She'd been warned repeatedly, "Don't touch anything, just dust and polish, be invisible." But as she moved methodically through the room, polishing chair arms and wiping the surface of that enormous table, something shifted inside her. She paused at the head of the table, her hand resting on the leather chair, the one reserved for power, for authority, for people nothing like her. Then she sat down. Maya Castellano had grown up watching her mother clean houses. Expensive houses in neighborhoods where people like them weren't supposed to spend more than the hours they were paid for. She knew the weight of invisible labor, the sting of being looked through rather than at. Her mother had sacrificed everything for Maya's education, working double shifts at the hospital where she'd eventually become a billing specialist. "Get out," her mother had whispered during their final conversation before Maya started at Meridian. "Get yourself out of this cycle. Be better than grateful. Be essential." Now, sitting in that leather chair at the head of the boardroom table, Maya felt something crystallize inside her. The chair was expensive. She could feel it in the way it swiveled smoothly, in the perfect lumbar support, in every detail designed for comfort and control. She ran her fingers along the polished wood of the armrest and allowed herself to imagine. Not in a delusional way, in a way that felt like remembering something she hadn't experienced yet. The boardroom was a cathedral of success. Glass panels separated it from the corridor, but also displayed it to anyone passing by. The walls held photographs of Meridian's leadership, all of them in expensive suits, confident smiles, the kind of people who'd never worried about whether they belonged in a room. Maya recognized some of their names from the employee handbook she'd studied obsessively over the weekend. Charles Whitmore, CEO, Victoria Chen, Chief Operating Officer, James Rothschild, Chief Financial Officer. These were the people who decided who climbed and who remained at the base. She heard footsteps in the corridor and straightened immediately, her heart hammering. It was just another intern, David, pushing a cart of refreshments. He did a double take when he saw her sitting at the head of the table, her cleaning supplies on the floor beside her. "Whoa," he said, stepping inside. "Aren't you supposed to be done with this place?" "I am," Maya said, standing quickly, her face burning. "Just taking a break." David was tall, confident, the kind of person who probably came from money. His internship was likely a family connection rather than a competitive application process. He set the water bottles and glasses on the credenza with the ease of someone who'd been given permissions his whole life. "Don't let anyone see you sitting up there," he said, not unkindly. "Jessica from HR is already watching the interns like hawks. One of the guys got told off for taking a coffee from the executive kitchen." "I know," Maya said. I was straightening the chairs." It wasn't a lie exactly. She had been touching the chairs, but it was a half-truth, and she could see that David didn't entirely believe her. Still, he shrugged and left, and Maya exhaled slowly. She had about 30 minutes now. She finished her polishing with mechanical efficiency, moving through the motions, her mind elsewhere. The brief moment of sitting in that chair had cracked something open in her. Not arrogance, but a question. What if she didn't have to stay invisible? By 1:55 p.m., the boardroom was immaculate. Every surface gleamed, the chairs were perfectly aligned, the presentation screens were clear. The water bottles were iced and arranged symmetrically. Maya had positioned herself outside the boardroom, near the elevators, pushing her cleaning cart in what she hoped was an appropriately invisible position. She watched as the executive team began to arrive. They moved with the unconscious authority of people accustomed to space and privilege. They didn't notice her. No one ever did. But as they filed in and took their seats around the table, Charles Whitmore paused. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been photographed frequently enough to develop a polished expression. He looked directly at Maya, and for a moment she wasn't sure what was about to happen. Was he going to tell her she was in the wrong place? Was this the moment she got in trouble? "Good work," he said simply, gesturing at the room. It looked sharp. Very professional. "Thank you, sir," Maya managed, shocked by the acknowledgement. He nodded and turned to address the gathering executives, already transitioning into whatever strategic conversation was about to unfold. But something had shifted. He'd seen her. Not really seen her. Not enough to remember her name or ask who she was. But he'd acknowledged the quality of her work. It was the first real validation she'd received in her professional life. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Maya wasn't supposed to linger, but the intern program included occasional observation opportunities, and because the conference room door had remained slightly open and no one had explicitly told her to leave, she found herself stationed near a quiet corner of the floor, visible enough to be useful if anything was needed, but invisible enough to not be intrusive. This was the dance of people without power, finding the acceptable margins, making yourself small enough that your presence became unremarkable. What she overheard during that meeting would change everything. The discussion centered on a struggling subsidiary called Meridian Innovations, a tech-focused division that had been bleeding money for 2 years. One of the executives, a woman named Patricia Hoffman, was presenting a case for complete restructuring. She was arguing, quite forcefully, that the leadership of the division needed to be replaced entirely. The current head, Robert Vance, had been with the company for 15 years, but the metrics under his watch had become increasingly dismal. "We need fresh blood," Patricia was saying, "someone with new ideas, someone who understands the market dynamics of today, not the market dynamics of 2010. "Robert's loyal," James Rothschild countered. "He's been with us through thick and thin. Loyalty matters." "Loyalty doesn't pay dividends," Patricia shot back, "and sentiment isn't a business strategy. Meridian Innovations is hemorrhaging talent. The quarterly reports show declining employee satisfaction, missed targets on every major project, and a total absence of innovation despite the division literally being called Innovations." Maya absorbed every word. The clinical way they discussed Robert's failure, the calculating logic of dismantling a man's career, the certainty that competence was the only currency that mattered at this level. It was education disguised as a private corporate discussion. Charles Whitmore had been largely silent, listening. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone whose opinion would determine the outcome. "I want a detailed proposal on my desk by Friday," he said. "I want names of potential replacements, internal and external candidates, and I want it to be airtight. If we're going to make this change, we make it decisively." The meeting concluded shortly after. The executives filed out, several of them in conversation, their minds already moving to the next item on their agenda. None of them noticed Maya, whose hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her cleaning cart. That evening, after she clocked out, Maya sat in the subway train heading back to Queens and allowed herself to think about what she'd learned. The man who'd complimented her work was the same man making decisions that would affect dozens of lives. Power was decision-making capacity. If you could decide what happened next, you mattered. If you couldn't, you were managed. Optimized sometimes, but ultimately managed like a resource. The next morning, Maya arrived early before anyone else and did something that would have horrified her supervisor if discovered. She accessed the company's internal network using her ID, which had basic employee access, and found the public business pages related to Meridian Innovations. She pulled quarterly reports, press releases, and employee reviews. She read about Robert Vance's career history, his educational background, his documented successes in the company's early years. Then, using her mother's old business textbooks and everything she'd absorbed in her college courses, she began to compile a simple analysis. If Robert Vance was the problem, what specifically was broken? And more importantly, was it actually broken, or had the market changed and his approach hadn't adapted? She worked during her lunch breaks, accumulating data, building a timeline. She wasn't trying to save Robert Vance's career, she barely knew him. What she was doing was something more fundamental, proving to herself that she could understand the logic of power, that she could think at the level where these decisions were made. By Thursday, she had something. A 20-page document, meticulously formatted, that outlined an alternative restructuring plan for Meridian Innovations. The core thesis was this: Robert Vance's approach wasn't wrong for what it was designed to do, but what Meridian Innovations needed to do had changed. Rather than replace him, what if he was paired with a chief innovation officer? Someone young, someone with current market expertise, someone who could translate his institutional knowledge into new methodologies. It was probably naive. It was probably presumptuous. Maya knew that interns who exceeded their boundaries didn't get hired. But something inside her was tired of being invisible, tired of protecting herself from the consequences of being ambitious. She printed the document, bound it professionally, and spent an entire evening trying to figure out how to deliver it to Charles Whitmore without getting fired. The opportunity came on Friday morning during a moment of administrative chaos. The executive assistants were dealing with a scheduling crisis, a conference call that was running over, meetings that needed to be rearranged, a catering order that had been placed incorrectly. In the confusion, Maya approached Victoria Chen's assistant, Sarah, and asked if she could help with anything. "Actually, yes," Sarah said, harried and grateful. "Can you run this memo to Charles's office? It's urgent." It was the perfect cover. Maya took the memo, added her document to the stack, and delivered everything to the executive suite on the 45th floor. She placed it on Charles Whitmore's desk, told his assistant it was priority, and left before she could second-guess herself. That afternoon, she was back at the cleaning station, reorganizing supplies, when she received a message on the employee communication system. It was from Charles Whitmore's office. Request: report to conference room B on the 45th floor at 4 p.m. Her stomach dropped. This was it. She was being fired for presumption, for overstepping, for sitting in that chair yesterday, metaphorically claiming space that wasn't hers. But she went. She arrived 3 minutes early, in her uniform, her name tag slightly crooked because her hands were shaking too much to fix it properly. Charles Whitmore was already there, her document in front of him, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Victoria Chen was with him, and so was Patricia Hoffman. "Close the door," Charles said. Maya's hands trembled as she did. "Tell me about this," Charles said, tapping her document. "I need to know everything. Who helped you with this? Which senior analyst gave you this perspective?" "No one, sir," Maya said quietly. "I did it. I'm sorry if I overstepped. I shouldn't have—" "That's not what I'm asking," he interrupted. "I'm asking for your analysis. Walk me through your logic." So she did. For the next 20 minutes, Maya Castellano, a 22-year-old intern whose official job was cleaning conference rooms, delivered a business analysis to the CEO, COO, and Chief Strategy Officer of Meridian Financial. She explained the market research, the employee retention data, the comparison between companies that had successfully navigated similar transitions and those that had failed. She outlined why the traditional approach to restructuring, replacement rather than reformation, often destroyed organizational culture without necessarily improving performance. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted approximately 3 eternities. Victoria spoke first. "This is good. This is really good. The employee retention angle is particularly strong. We've been focused so much on metrics that we haven't fully accounted for institutional knowledge loss." Patricia was frowning, but it was the frown of someone reconsidering, rather than dismissing. It's competent, but it's also idealistic. Robert Vance has had plenty of time to evolve his approach. At some point, new leadership isn't a failure of the person. It's just time. "True," Maya heard herself say. Then she stopped, terrified that she'd spoken out of turn. But Charles was looking at her with interest, so she continued. "But the question isn't whether change would help. The question is which kind of change would produce better results for the company. If the goal is shareholder value, you need to calculate the cost of transition, recruitment, training, lost productivity, while the new person learns the organization, against the benefit of bringing in someone external. Sometimes the math says replace. Sometimes it says reform. I was trying to show the math." Charles removed his glasses and studied her. "What's your name?" "Maya Castellano, sir." "How long have you been at Meridian?" "Officially?" 12 days. But I've been preparing for this kind of work my whole life." He smiled. "I believe it. I want to offer you something. We have an opening in our strategic analysis division. Still an internship, but it's a paid role that reports to the business analytics team. You'd be part of the group that does the kind of research you've just demonstrated. The salary is $45,000 annually with benefits, and it's a path to a full-time position if you perform well. Are you interested? Maya's vision blurred. $45,000. Health insurance. A path forward. Everything she'd been told she'd have to earn through years of loyal service was being offered in exchange for being seen, for thinking at the level that mattered, for refusing to stay invisible. Yes, she said. Yes, sir, I'm very interested. Good. Patricia will work with HR on the paperwork. You'll start in the new role Monday. And Maya, that analysis is good, but it could be excellent if you can smooth out the edges on the methodology section and add some comparative case studies from other companies that have successfully implemented hybrid restructuring models. I want that on my desk by next Thursday. I will, Maya promised. I'll get it perfect. As she left the conference room, Victoria called out, "And you might want to find a better dry cleaner. Your uniform is clean, but it's showing wear. When you're moving into the analysis division, appearance matters a little more. Not much, we judge on competence, but a little." It wasn't unkind, just practical. Maya nodded, understanding the unspoken message. She was being invited into a world that had its own rules, and the rules included not just thinking correctly, but appearing the part. The following weeks were a period of transformation that went far deeper than a new wardrobe. Though Maya did invest in 3 professional blazers and 2 pairs of quality dress pants. She moved into her new role in a cubicle near the analytics division, surrounded by people with MBAs and prestigious university degrees. They were initially skeptical of the intern who'd somehow bypassed the normal hierarchy, but her work spoke for itself. She delivered the expanded analysis to Charles Whitmore on the Thursday deadline, and it became the foundation for the company's decision to implement a hybrid restructuring of Meridian Innovations. Robert Vance remained as head of the division, but was paired with a newly hired Chief Innovation Officer, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who brought current market expertise in AI and machine learning applications to financial services. The restructuring wasn't just Maya's idea. Patricia and Victoria and several other executives contributed to refining it, but the core framework, the thinking that shifted the conversation from replacement to reformation, came from her. Within 6 months, Meridian Innovations showed improvement in both metrics and employee satisfaction. More importantly, Maya had become visible. She moved through the office differently now. People knew her name. She was invited to strategy meetings and asked for her opinions. She was asked to analyze problems before they became crises. And every single day she understood what had happened in that moment when she'd sat down in that leather chair at the head of the boardroom table. She hadn't been fantasizing about power. She'd been rehearsing it. She'd been visualizing a version of herself that belonged in spaces of decision-making. And in doing so, she'd created the neural pathways that would allow her to actually belong there when the opportunity arose. One evening, 8 months after her first day, Maya was working late in the office, reviewing a market analysis for an upcoming board presentation. Charles Whitmore passed by her cubicle and stopped. "Still here at 8 o'clock?" he asked. "Just finishing up," Maya said. The CFO wanted this ready for the board presentation tomorrow. He glanced at the work on her screen, then at her. "You've made remarkable progress in a short time. Have you thought about what you want to do after your internship ends?" "I'm hoping for a full-time position here," Maya said carefully, "in strategic analysis, or potentially something broader. I've been thinking a lot about what makes some companies adapt well to market changes and others struggle. I think there's an opportunity in that analysis." "There is," he agreed, "and you're the kind of mind that could develop it. I'm going to recommend you for our leadership development program. It's competitive, but you'll get your foot in the door. And Maya, that thing you said in the meeting about calculating the cost of transition, that's how executives think. You're already thinking like one. Just remember not to lose sight of the human element. The metrics matter, but people matter more. The best decisions balance both." After he left, Maya sat alone in the quiet office and thought about her mother, who'd spent decades making houses beautiful for people who barely noticed the work. She thought about invisibility and the price of being overlooked. And she thought about that moment when she'd sat in a chair that wasn't hers and allowed herself to imagine a different future. The transformation hadn't been magical or instantaneous. It had been the result of observation, preparation, and one moment of small rebellion, followed by months of relentless excellence. But it had been real. 3 years later, Maya Castellano was promoted to Senior Strategic Analyst, a position that came with a 6-figure salary, a corner office, and a seat in meetings that shaped corporate strategy. She'd completed her bachelor's degree while working, earning a scholarship that covered most of the costs. She'd published research on organizational restructuring that had been cited in business journals. And she'd become the kind of person who made decisions about other people's careers and futures. But what she remembered most clearly wasn't the promotion or the salary or the office with the window view. It was that moment before everything changed, when she'd been 22 years old and exhausted and cleaning a boardroom on her first day. And she'd sat down in a chair at the head of a table where she didn't think she was allowed to be. Not in arrogance, but in curiosity. Not claiming the seat permanently, but testing whether she could survive there, whether she belonged in spaces of power. She had. She did. And though she never would have predicted it, that single moment of quiet rebellion, that small refusal to stay invisible, had been the catalyst for everything that followed. On the wall of her office, where other executives displayed their framed degrees and professional certifications, Maya kept a simple photograph. It was from her college graduation, taken by her mother, showing a young woman in a cap and gown, exhausted and exhilarated, and standing exactly where she'd promised herself she would be. Below it, on a small brass plate, she'd had inscribed a single phrase: "The table was always big enough." But the photograph didn't tell the entire story. The part that wasn't visible in the frame was what had happened the night before her graduation, when her mother had called her from the hospital where she worked the night shift, her voice breaking in a way Maya had never heard before. "I can't make it tomorrow," her mother had whispered. "I'm so sorry, Mija. My shift supervisor is sick, and there's no one to cover. If I don't work this shift, I lose the overtime bonus, and we need that money for your fall semester." Maya had felt something collapse inside her chest. The graduation ceremony meant everything. It was proof that their sacrifices had translated into something concrete, something that couldn't be taken away or diminished by circumstance. Her mother had worked through her own pain, through exhaustion that had aged her prematurely, through the indignity of people who treated her as invisible while she cleaned their homes and processed their insurance claims. And now, on the one day that was supposed to be theirs, when they were supposed to stand together and acknowledge what they'd built, her mother couldn't come. "I'll be fine," Maya had said, lying expertly. They were both liars now, she and her mother, living on the currency of small untruths that kept them functioning. But when graduation day arrived, her mother was there. Maya learned later that she'd called in a favor she shouldn't have called in, arranged a shift swap with a colleague she barely knew, risked the displeasure of her supervisor. She'd shown up in the audience with dark circles under her eyes and a smile that was so fierce it could have powered a city. And when Maya walked across that stage, her mother's hands had been the loudest in the entire auditorium. Now, sitting in her corner office on the 42nd floor, looking at that photograph, Maya understood that the image captured something that the photograph itself couldn't explain: the weight of inherited determination. Her mother's sacrifice wasn't just in the background of her success, it was woven into her cells, a kind of cellular memory of what it cost to rise. The office around her reflected her new position. The furniture was expensive but understated. The artwork on the walls, carefully curated pieces from emerging artists, most of them women, suggested a person with taste and the resources to indulge it. The books on her shelves were a mix: business texts, philosophy, biography, poetry. She'd learned early that powerful people didn't read only what their role required them to read. They read widely, extensively, in ways that revealed an intellectual life that extended beyond their job description. Her assistant, David, a different David than the one from her internship, though often she wondered about that David's trajectory, knocked and entered with her afternoon coffee. She always drank it black, not because she loved black coffee, but because she'd once overheard Charles Whitmore say that he drank his coffee black because it was simpler than explaining preferences, and power, he'd said, was partly about not needing to explain yourself. "You have a meeting in 10 minutes, David said, the new candidate for the restructuring analyst position. Maya nodded, pulling up the candidate's file on her computer. This was the part of the job that had surprised her most. She was now the one making decisions about who got let in. The responsibility weighed differently than she'd expected. When she'd been climbing, she'd thought of power as something that would feel validating, that would salve some wound inflicted by years of invisibility. But now that she held it, she understood that power was mostly about decisions that hurt people, even when you tried your best to make them wisely. The candidate arrived at 2 p.m. sharp, a young woman named Amara Okafor, 24, who'd graduated from Columbia with a degree in economics and had worked for 2 years at a smaller financial services firm. She was nervous, which was understandable, but her nervousness had an edge to it that Maya recognized. It was the nervousness of someone who knew that the room she was entering had been built by and for people who didn't look like her, speak like her, or come from where she came from. "Tell me about your most significant analytical project," Maya said, gesturing for Amara to sit. Amara described a market analysis she'd conducted for her previous firm. A solid piece of work that showed competence, but not brilliance. Maya listened, asked follow-up questions, watched how Amara responded to challenge. The young woman held her ground, didn't apologize for her conclusions, offered additional data points when pressed. "Why do you want this job?" Maya asked. "Because you do work that matters," Amara said simply, "and because I want to be where people like me are deciding what gets decided." Maya understood exactly what she meant. It wasn't about the salary or the title, though those mattered. It was about claiming space in rooms where decisions were made, where the future was written in quarterly reports and strategic initiatives. It was about being visible to the people who mattered. "The work is demanding," Maya said. "You'll be expected to produce analyses on tight timelines. You'll be questioned, challenged, sometimes dismissed. You'll work with people who have been here longer and have more credentials. You need to be both confident and coachable. Can you do that?" "Yes," Amara said, and she meant it. Maya could see it in her shoulders, in the way she met Maya's eyes. "Good. I'll recommend you for the position. You'll start in 2 weeks. David at the front desk will send you the onboarding information." Maya stood, extending her hand. "Welcome to Meridian." As Amara left, Maya felt something shift in her understanding of her own trajectory. She hadn't just moved from one position to another. She'd crossed a threshold where she now had the power to open doors for people like her. Not out of charity, but because she recognized competence and potential when she saw it. Amara would probably become excellent at her job. She'd probably also face the same microaggressions, the same moments of being overlooked, the same need to prove herself twice as competent to be considered equal. But at least Maya could make sure that her early career at Meridian wasn't spent cleaning boardrooms, while others had the privilege of sitting at tables. That evening, Maya called her mother. It was Thursday, her mother's late day. She worked until 10 p.m. at the hospital, processing insurance claims in a basement office that never saw sunlight. But she always took Maya's calls, even if it was just for 5 minutes between tasks. "I hired someone today," Maya said. "A young woman, smart, ambitious. She reminds me of how I felt when I started here." "That's good," her mother said, and Maya could hear the smile in her voice. "You're passing it forward." "I'm trying to," Maya said, "but I'm also realizing how much of this was just luck. If Charles Whitmore had been a different kind of person, if he hadn't valued independent thinking, if David hadn't come in that moment when I was sitting in the wrong chair, everything would have been different." "Luck is real," her mother said. "But luck finds people who are prepared. You were prepared, Mija. You'd been preparing your whole life. I made sure of it." After they hung up, Maya sat in her apartment, a one-bedroom in Manhattan that still felt surreal, that she sometimes had to remind herself she actually owned, and thought about preparation and luck and the invisibility that had shaped her before visibility claimed her. The next morning, she arrived at the office early, as she usually did. The cleaning crew was finishing up. A team of 5, all of them moving efficiently through the hallways, making sure that the space where decisions were made was clean and ready. Maya recognized one of them, a woman named Carmen, who'd been with Meridian for nearly a decade. Carmen was probably in her 50s, with streaks of grey in her hair and a quiet efficiency that suggested someone who'd learned to survive by being inconspicuous. Maya had never had a real conversation with Carmen, though she'd seen her hundreds of times over the years. This morning, she stopped her in the hallway. "Carmen, right?" Maya said. Carmen looked surprised to be addressed by name. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Maya Castellano. I work in strategic analysis." "I know who you are," Carmen said gently. "I remember when you were doing this job. You cleaned the boardroom on your first day." Maya felt something catch in her throat. "You remember that?" "I remember a lot of things," Carmen said. "I remember when young people like you came in and tried hard and weren't sure if they belonged. I remember most of them getting worn down, starting to believe that they were only good enough for the work that nobody else wanted to do. But I also remember you. You had a different look about you. Like you were studying the place, learning how it worked." "Would you like to grab coffee with me?" Maya asked. "This afternoon in the cafe downstairs. I'd like to hear your perspective on things." Carmen hesitated, and Maya understood why. Visible fraternization across job levels was unusual. It could be perceived as unprofessional, could invite speculation and gossip. But Carmen agreed, and that afternoon they sat in the corporate cafe and talked for nearly an hour. Carmen had been an accountant in El Salvador, educated and credentialed in her own country. But when she'd immigrated to the United States, those credentials didn't transfer. She'd been told to go back to school, to get American certifications, to jump through the endless loops of qualification that were really just mechanisms to keep certain people in certain positions. She'd had 2 children to support, couldn't afford to not work, so she'd started cleaning houses, then moved to corporate cleaning contracts because the pay was slightly better and the work was more predictable. "Did you ever try to go back into accounting?" Maya asked. "Once," Carmen said. "When my kids were teenagers, I tried to take some courses at community college. But I was working full-time, and the classes were expensive, and my supervisor at the time, not the one we have now, made it clear that if I was going to be serious about the cleaning job, I couldn't be dividing my attention. So I stopped. My kids went to college, though. Better than I did. They're both working now, respectable jobs. That's what I got out of all this." Maya felt the weight of that statement. Carmen had spent 3 decades making invisible contributions, creating the conditions for other people's success, while her own potential remained locked in a version of herself that the country had decided wasn't American enough, credentialed enough, or deserving enough. "What if that could change?" Maya asked quietly. "It can't," Carmen said, but not bitterly. "I'm 53. I'm too old to start over. My kids are fine. I'm fine. This job, it lets me provide for myself with dignity. That's more than a lot of people get." But something in the conversation stayed with Maya. She went back to her office and pulled up the Meridian Human Resources system. She looked at Carmen's file, her employment history, her educational background, her performance reviews, which were all glowing. She found the certifications that Carmen had attempted to pursue and the community college courses she'd started. Then Maya did something that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. She scheduled a meeting with the Director of Human Resources and proposed something radical: a Meridian-sponsored education program for employees in support positions who wanted to advance into professional roles. The company would cover tuition for courses and certifications. Employees would be given flexible scheduling to attend classes. For every person who successfully completed a degree or certification and moved into a professional position, Meridian would get both a trained employee and enormous publicity around being an organization that developed talent from within. It was good for the company's image, it was good for business, but it was also quietly an act of subversion. It was Maya using the logic of capitalism to dismantle in small ways the systems that had kept her and people like her invisible. The program was approved. It was launched quietly, without much fanfare, as a pilot initiative. Carmen was the first person to apply. She started taking evening accounting courses at a local university, with Meridian covering the costs and giving her adjusted hours so she could attend classes. It took her 3 years of evening study while working full-time, but she earned her American CPA certification. She was the first graduate of the program, and when she passed her final exam, Maya made sure to be there, in the coffee shop near the testing center, when Carmen came out and started to cry. "I did it," Carmen kept saying, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "I actually did it." Within 6 months, Carmen had transitioned into a role in the company's accounting division. She wasn't running the department. That would have required her to start sooner, when she had more time to build seniority. But she was visible now. She was essential. Her decades of careful observation and attention had given her insights that made her valuable in ways that a typical accountant who'd learned the job in a classroom might not possess. But more important than Carmen's individual success was what her success represented. Other employees began to apply for the program. Over 5 years, 17 people moved from support positions into professional roles. They came from housekeeping, from food service, from the mailroom. They brought with them perspectives that had been absent from the organization, experiences that enriched the culture in ways that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Maya's reputation shifted. She was no longer just the junior executive who'd impressed the CEO. She was the person who'd fundamentally changed how the organization thought about development and opportunity. She was the person who understood that talent wasn't concentrated in elite universities or wealthy families. It was everywhere, often hiding in plain sight because the systems weren't built to see it. By her 30th birthday, Maya had been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Development. She reported directly to Charles Whitmore, who was now in his 70s and thinking about succession. He'd never married, had no children, and had spent his career building Meridian into a financial powerhouse. In many ways, Maya was the successor he'd been looking for, someone who could think strategically, someone who understood both the numbers and the human element, someone who'd come from nothing and therefore understood the need for structures that were meritocratic rather than hereditary. "I'm thinking about stepping down in 3 years," he told her one afternoon in the same conference room where she'd first presented her analysis about Meridian innovations. "Maybe 2 if the board agrees. I want to recommend you as my successor. Not immediately, you'll need more board experience, maybe a position as president first. But you're the trajectory I see." Maya's hands had started shaking. CEO. It was the logical endpoint of everything she'd been working toward, but saying it out loud, having it confirmed by the person who'd first seen her potential, made it real in a way that private ambition never could. "I want to do it," she said. "I want to run this company the right way." "There is no right way," Charles said with a slight smile. "There's only your way. And I hope your way involves continuing what you've started with the development program. But I also hope it involves making hard decisions, firing people who need to be fired, saying no when the board wants you to say yes. Power is the ability to make choices that matter. Don't waste it being liked." Over the next 3 years, Maya prepared herself in ways that went far beyond the professional. She expanded her network, joined boards of non-profit organizations, became active in industry associations. She published a paper on organizational culture and performance that was cited in business schools. She gave a TED Talk about discovering talent in unexpected places that went viral and gave her a national profile. She also went back to school, completing an MBA from Columbia Business School at night and on weekends. She was exhausted most of the time, living on coffee and determination, but she understood that credentials mattered, that the appearance of qualification was part of the armor you needed to survive at the highest levels. When she was 32, Maya became president of Meridian Financial. When she was 35, after Charles Whitmore retired, she became CEO. The announcement made business journals. She was profiled in major magazines. She was the woman who'd worked her way up from nothing, the story that America loved because it validated the myth that anyone could make it if they worked hard enough. What they didn't usually mention was the luck, the moment when she sat in a chair that wasn't hers, the supervisor who hadn't fired her on the spot, the CEO who'd been generous enough to see potential in someone who looked nothing like him. But Maya remembered. She carried all of it with her, in a kind of internal accounting of how she'd gotten here. And more importantly, she made sure that others got here too. The first decision she made as CEO was to expand the development program into a permanent, fully funded initiative that would eventually place 100 people in professional positions within 5 years. The second decision was to commit to a 40% target for women and minorities in senior leadership positions within 3 years, an aggressive goal that prompted significant pushback from the board. "It's not about charity," she told them, in a board meeting where she was surrounded by people who'd been born into their positions, who'd never had to wonder if they belonged. "It's about optimizing human capital. We're currently drawing our leadership from a pool of maybe 15% of the population. Imagine what we're losing by not drawing from the full 100%. Imagine the ideas that aren't being shared, the problems that aren't being solved because the people who could solve them aren't in the room where solutions get decided. It was pure logic, stripped of sentiment, which was the only language that convinced boards of directors. But it was also true. Meridian began a deliberate campaign to recruit, develop, and promote people who hadn't come up through traditional paths. Some of them came from the development program. Others were hired from outside, women and minorities and people from working-class backgrounds who had something to prove, and the hunger to prove it. Within 3 years, Meridian's leadership team had been transformed. Within 5 years, the company's stock price had increased 37%, significantly outpacing the market. The business press wrote about the Castellano effect, the idea that diverse leadership and inclusive development practices actually made companies more profitable. It wasn't magic. It was just what happened when you made sure that the people making decisions had experienced enough of the world that they could make better decisions. But the thing that meant the most to Maya wasn't the business success or the profile or the fact that she'd become one of the most powerful women in finance. It was the moment when she was sitting in her CEO office, a space that felt too large, too quiet, even after 2 years of occupying it. And her mother called. Her mother was 73 now, and she'd finally retired. She'd spent 45 years working as a cleaner, as a hospital billing specialist, in jobs that asked for everything and offered little in return. She'd put her daughter through college. She'd sacrificed her health and her time and her own potential. And now, finally, she had the luxury of rest. "I saw the article," her mother said. It was a profile in Forbes titled "From Invisible to Indispensable." How Maya Castellano is rewriting the rules of leadership. "Which part?" Maya asked, smiling. "The part where you talked about me," her mother said, and her voice was thick. "The part where you said that everything you are is because someone loved you enough to work themselves to exhaustion so that you could have options." "That's not an exaggeration," Maya said softly. "I know. But reading it in a magazine that important, seeing our story told like it mattered. Mija, this is the greatest gift anyone's ever given me. Not the money, not the car you got me, not the house. This. The acknowledgement. The visibility." After they hung up, Maya sat alone in her office and thought about the long path that had led her here. Not the career trajectory, that was just a series of decisions and opportunities and luck, all the normal ingredients of professional success. But the emotional trajectory, the journey from invisibility to being seen, from wondering if she belonged to building spaces where people like her were essential. She thought about that moment on her first day, sitting in the leather chair at the head of the boardroom table, and all the moments that had followed. Presenting her analysis, working late, hiring Amara, inviting Carmen for coffee, becoming vice president, becoming president, becoming CEO. Each moment had been a small act of claiming space, of saying through her presence and her work and her decisions that people like her deserved to be at the table, deserved to be heard, deserved to be part of determining the future. The photograph from her college graduation still hung in her office. But next to it, she'd added a new image, a picture of her and Carmen, taken at Carmen's graduation from community college, both of them smiling, both of them standing on ground they'd fought for. And below that photograph, she had another brass plate installed. It read, "The table grows when we expand it." Years later, when Maya was writing a memoir about her career and her path to the CEO position, she would come back again and again to that first day at Meridian, to that moment of small rebellion when she'd sat down in a chair that wasn't hers. She would try to pinpoint exactly what had changed in that moment, what invisible shift had occurred that made her different from the thousands of other interns who'd worked their way through the company and never made it past mid-level management. The answer, she would realize, wasn't something that happened in that moment at all. It was something that had been happening for her whole life. Every time her mother had chosen to work an extra shift so that Maya could have tutoring instead of getting a part-time job. Every time her mother had said, "You belong here," and meant it not as comfort but as fact, as something as inevitable as gravity. The moment in the boardroom was just the moment when Maya finally believed it herself. But believing it and living it were two separate things. The years between that first moment of doubt and the certainty she now possessed were filled with moments where that belief had wavered, where the structures she'd been trying to navigate had pushed back against her presence with an insistence that was sometimes subtle and sometimes brutally direct. There was the time, during her second year at Meridian, when she'd been invited to present her findings on market trends to a group of senior executives and portfolio managers. She'd prepared meticulously, had practiced her presentation in the empty conference room on 3 separate occasions, had written and rewritten her talking points until they flowed naturally from her lips. She'd worn her best suit, the navy one that made her look serious and capable, and had arrived 15 minutes early. The meeting had been moved, she was told when she arrived. New location, same time. She'd rushed to the new conference room, a smaller space on the opposite side of the floor, and found herself facing a table of 12 men, all of them older than her, all of them with the kind of confidence that came from never having questioned their right to be in rooms where important things happened. The presentation had gone well until the Q&A segment. One of the portfolio managers, a man named Richard Castellano, the irony of sharing his surname was not lost on her, had interrupted her mid-explanation of her analysis. "These numbers seem optimistic," he'd said, his tone suggesting that optimism was a character flaw she should have corrected. "Are you accounting for the possibility of market contraction?" "Yes," Maya had said, pulling up her backup slides. "I've modeled 3 scenarios: expansion, stability, and contraction. The contraction scenario assumes a 15% decline in market growth, which is within the historical range of what we've seen in the last 2 decades. Seems like you're banking on the market continuing to behave according to historical patterns," Richard had continued. "But markets are unpredictable. They surprise us. History isn't always a good predictor of the future." It was a valid point, and under different circumstances, Maya would have appreciated the intellectual challenge. But the way he'd said it, with a subtle implication that she was naive, that her youth had blinded her to the complexity of markets, had made her understand something crucial about how the world worked. When a man presented analysis based on historical patterns, it was called experience. When a woman did it, it was called naivety. She'd taken a breath and responded carefully. "You're right that markets can surprise us. But surprise isn't a prediction. If we abandon historical analysis because of the possibility of black swan events, we abandon the ability to make any predictions at all. What I'm offering is a probabilistic framework that acknowledges both the most likely outcomes and the range of possible outliers. The analysis doesn't eliminate uncertainty, it quantifies it." The room had gone quiet. She'd seen Richard's jaw tighten slightly, and she'd understood that she'd done something wrong. Not in her analysis was sound, but in her delivery. She'd been too confident, too willing to challenge his implicit authority. A woman in that position was supposed to defer, to present her findings humbly, to acknowledge the greater wisdom of the men in the room. But Maya had spent too many years learning to be invisible, and she wasn't about to become small again now. She'd held Richard's gaze until he looked away, and she'd finished her presentation to a room that felt subtly hostile, though no one said anything overtly negative. Later, she'd learned that Richard had complained to her supervisor about her attitude problem and lack of respect for institutional knowledge. Her supervisor had called her into his office and warned her to be more collaborative, to focus on building consensus rather than defending her position. "You were right," he'd said, and she could hear the sympathy in his voice, which made it worse somehow. "Your analysis was sound. But in this organization, how you present matters as much as what you present. You need to learn to make people feel like they're part of the discovery process, even when you've already done the work." Maya had nodded and said nothing, but inside she was cataloguing this lesson like everything else. This was how power worked. It wasn't just about being right. It was about making other people feel that their status, their authority, their right to be in the room was being respected. It was a negotiation of ego disguised as intellectual rigor. She'd applied that lesson in every interaction that followed. She'd learned to present her strongest findings as questions rather than conclusions. She'd learned to defer to the older men in the room while still steering the conversation toward her preferred outcome. She'd learned to make them believe that their final decision had been their idea all along. It was exhausting, the constant calculation of how much confidence to display, how much deference to show, how much of her actual intelligence to reveal, and how much to keep hidden. But it worked. Within 6 months of adjusting her approach, Richard and the other senior portfolio managers began to seek out her analyses. They began to incorporate her thinking into their strategies. She became indispensable by making herself appear dispensable, by never threatening the authority of the people who held actual power. And then, 5 years into her career at Meridian, Charles Whitmore had called her into his office and offered her the path to the executive suite. Everything had changed again. The rules that had governed her interactions as a junior analyst no longer applied. As she moved into leadership, she discovered that a different set of rules was in place. Rules that were simultaneously more forgiving and more demanding. As a leader, she was allowed to be confident. She was expected to be confident. Uncertainty was weakness at that level, but she was also still a woman, still someone who didn't fit the profile of what corporate America expected a senior executive to look like. The balance became even more precarious. She'd had her strategy questioned by board members who'd never questioned the strategy of her male predecessors. She'd had her appearance commented on in ways that would never have been acceptable if directed at a man. Someone had once suggested she soften her look a bit, maybe try a different hairstyle, and seemed genuinely surprised when Maya had responded coldly that her hairstyle had never affected her ability to analyze financial data. There had been the situation with James Patterson, the chief financial officer who'd seen her as a threat. He was a man in his 60s who'd been passed over for the CEO position when Charles had first suggested that Maya was the future of the company. James had spent the next several years trying to undermine her, leaking stories to the press about her inexperience, questioning her decisions in board meetings, building alliances with board members who were uncomfortable with her rapid rise. Maya could have fought him directly, but she understood that the optics of a young woman attacking an older man, even in justified self-defense, would be interpreted as aggression in a way that his attacks on her were not. So instead, she'd beaten him at his own game. She'd gathered data on his financial decisions that had looked good in the short term, but had resulted in long-term underperformance. She'd documented his resistance to strategic initiatives that had subsequently proven profitable. And when the right moment came, when the board was reviewing compensation and succession planning, she'd presented her findings to Charles in a way that made it clear that James's continued employment was costing the company money. He'd been offered early retirement, which he'd accepted with a severance package that was generous enough to preserve his dignity. But everyone in the organization understood what had really happened. Maya had eliminated a threat. She'd done it cleanly, professionally, without ever raising her voice or making it personal. And she'd done it in a way that demonstrated she understood power as well as the men who'd always had it. That was the moment when some of the other executives had started to truly respect her. Not because she was a woman, not because she'd overcome obstacles, but because she'd shown herself willing to do what needed to be done. She'd stopped being the promising young executive and had become an actual power player. But the cost of that transformation was something she'd only begun to understand years later. She'd learned to be ruthless in ways that she sometimes regretted. She'd made decisions that had affected people's lives, families, futures. Some of those decisions had been necessary and right. Some of them had been necessary, and she still wasn't sure if they were right. There was the restructuring of the operations division that had resulted in 200 jobs being eliminated. The analysis had been sound. The division was overstaffed, inefficient, bleeding resources. Combining it with another division and automating several processes made business sense. But standing in her office on the day the announcements went out, reading the messages from employees who were panicking about their mortgages and their health care, Maya had felt something crack inside her. She'd called Carmen that evening. Carmen had made the transition from support staff to accounting professional and was now in a leadership role herself, helping to manage the very program that had changed her life. They'd become genuine friends, something that probably wasn't supposed to happen between someone at her level and someone who'd worked in her division. But Carmen had taught her something that no business school could: how to hold power without losing your humanity. "I just laid off 200 people," Maya had said without preamble. "I know," Carmen had said gently. "I saw the announcement. How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure," Maya had admitted. "It was the right decision. The numbers say it was right. The company needed it. But I keep thinking about people who might lose their houses, people whose kids are about to start college." "Did you try to minimize the impact?" Carmen had asked. We offered severance packages, job placement services, an extra 3 months of healthcare coverage beyond what was required, Maya had said. We tried to do it as humanely as possible. Then you did what you could, Carmen had said. When I was cleaning houses, I saw what happens when companies are cruel. I saw families destroyed because someone cared more about profit than about people. You're making hard decisions, but you're trying to make them in a way that doesn't destroy people's lives. That matters. It was generous, perhaps more generous than Maya deserved, but she'd held on to that conversation in the weeks and months that followed, using it as an anchor when the weight of her decisions threatened to pull her under. She'd kept that same principle in mind as she rose through the ranks and eventually into the CEO position. She'd made decisions that had benefited the company, that had increased shareholder value, that had generated profits. But she'd tried never to lose sight of the fact that those numbers represented human beings, that the quarterly reports were built on the labor and intelligence of thousands of people who depended on the organization for their survival. It wasn't perfect. She'd made mistakes. There were decisions she'd made that she replayed in her mind at 3 a.m, wondering if there had been a better way. But she'd also created structures that pushed back against the worst impulses of capitalism. She'd insisted on a living wage for all employees. She'd fought for mental health coverage and parental leave and other benefits that went beyond what was industry standard. She'd expanded the development program beyond her initial vision, making it a pipeline that ensured that talented people from every background had a path forward. These decisions had cost the company money. They'd also, as it turned out, made the company more profitable by creating a culture of loyalty and engagement that was rare in financial services. Employees who felt valued and respected didn't leave. They worked harder, they innovated, they understood that the success of the organization was their success. But the personal cost to Maya had been something she hadn't fully anticipated. Being CEO meant being alone in a way that she'd never experienced before. There was no one she could fully confide in, no one she could let see her doubts or her fears. Her mother understood her, but she was her mother. The conversation had an inherent imbalance. Carmen was her closest friend, but Carmen had also worked for her, had benefited from her patronage, and that dynamic colored everything. Charles Whitmore had warned her about this when he'd been preparing her to take over. Leadership is a kind of isolation, he'd said. The higher you go, the fewer people you can truly be honest with. Everyone has an agenda with you. Even the people who love you, they want something from you. Approval, validation, advancement. It's one of the costs of power that they don't tell you about in business school. She'd understood intellectually, but she hadn't really believed it until she was living it. Until she was sitting in her office at 10 o'clock at night, alone, making decisions that would affect thousands of lives, with no one to talk to about the weight of it. Until she realized that the vast majority of her relationships had some element of transaction to them, even the ones that had started with genuine connection. The loneliness had driven her to work even harder. If she couldn't have real friendship, she could at least have the satisfaction of doing the job well. If she couldn't share her burdens, she could at least make sure that her burdens resulted in something good for the people who worked for her. She'd poured herself into the company, into perfecting her strategies, into building something that would outlast her, something that would be better because she'd led it. She'd sacrificed romantic relationships because she didn't have time for them and because the power dynamic made them complicated. She'd missed family dinners because there was always one more meeting, one more analysis to review. She'd spent her 30s advancing her career at a pace that was almost inhuman, driven by something that she only sometimes understood. Part of it was hunger, the same hunger that had driven her as an intern, the need to prove that she belonged, that her presence in these rooms was deserved and valuable. Part of it was fear. She'd come from nothing, and if she stopped working, if she let down her guard for even a moment, everything could disappear. The office could evaporate, the respect could vanish. She could wake up back in her childhood apartment, listening to her mother come home exhausted from a 12-hour shift. But there was also something else, something that she only began to articulate in her 40s when the novelty of success had worn off and she was left with the reality of what she'd built. It was a desire to create a world that was different from the one she'd grown up in. A world where talent was recognized regardless of how you looked or where you'd come from. A world where hard work actually resulted in advancement, where people weren't trapped in invisible positions. where the table was big enough for everyone. That desire had manifested in the development program, but it had extended into everything she'd done as CEO. It was why she'd insisted on publishing salary equity reports, why she'd pushed for mentorship programs, why she'd fought to ensure that promotion decisions were based on actual competence, rather than on how well you fit the profile of what a leader was supposed to look like. Some of these initiatives had made her unpopular with certain board members and certain investors who saw them as unnecessary expenses, as indulgence that cut into profits. But others, the ones who understood that long-term value was built on culture and retention and innovation, had supported her. By the time Maya was in her mid-40s, Meridian Financial had been transformed. It was still a profit-driven organization. It had to be. That was the entire point of the business. But it was also a company where people mattered, where human beings were seen as assets to be developed rather than resources to be exploited. The development program had become the gold standard in the industry. Other companies had begun to replicate it. Business schools used Meridian as a case study for inclusive leadership. Maya had been invited to speak at conferences, to write articles, to mentor other executives about how to build organizations that were both profitable and purposeful. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd risen to the very top by learning the rules of power and then using that power to change the rules. She'd become the establishment by being willing to reimagine what the establishment could be. It was on an ordinary Thursday morning, during her 9th year as CEO, that everything shifted again. She was in her office reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant mentioned that there was a young woman asking to speak with her. No appointment, no introduction, just a request to talk to the CEO. Normally, Maya would have said no. She had a schedule, a system, gatekeepers whose entire job was to manage access to her time. But something in the description intrigued her. A young woman, determined, apparently refusing to leave until she got 5 minutes. "Send her in," Maya said. The woman who entered her office couldn't have been more than 22. She was wearing clothes that were clean but clearly inexpensive, and she carried herself with the kind of nervous energy that came from being in a space where she felt she didn't belong. Maya recognized that energy immediately. She'd worn it herself all those years ago. "What's your name?" Maya asked. "Jessica Reyes," the young woman said. "I'm sorry to barge in like this, but I didn't know any other way to get to talk to you." "Sit down," Maya said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "You have 5 minutes." Jessica took a deep breath and began to talk. She was a first-year intern in the operations division. She'd come from a poor neighborhood in the Bronx. Her mother was a home health aide. Her father had worked as a custodian at a hospital until health problems forced him into disability. She'd gotten into a decent college, but had to drop out after her first year because she couldn't afford the tuition. She'd been working retail and food service when she heard about Meridian's internship program. "I applied because I thought maybe I could get hired permanently," Jessica said. "I wanted to work my way up, like I heard you did. But I'm starting to realize that's maybe not how it actually works. There's this whole group of interns, and I'm good at my job, really good, but the supervisors don't seem to notice. The other interns, they all seem like they're on some track that I'm not on. Like they know something I don't." Maya listened, and as she listened, she was transported back to her own first days at Meridian. She'd been so afraid of getting things wrong, so desperate to be invisible, so uncertain that she had any right to be there. "I came to you because I read that article about you," Jessica continued. "The one where you talked about how you started as an intern, how you believed in yourself even when no one else did. I thought if I could just talk to you, maybe I could understand what I'm supposed to do differently. How do you become visible?" It was such a simple question, and it contained such complexity. Maya took a moment to gather her thoughts. "You sit in the chair," she said finally. "The chair that isn't yours. You sit down and you let yourself imagine that you belong there. Not arrogantly, not in a way that's disrespectful to the people actually sitting in those chairs right now. But you sit down and you study what they do, how they think, what makes them powerful. And then you do the work to actually belong there." "I don't understand," Jessica said. "I do now," Maya said, standing up and walking to the window. From her office, you could see across the city, the entire panorama of Manhattan laid out like a promise. "But I didn't then. When I was you, I just knew I had to climb. I didn't think about where I was climbing to. I just knew that where I was, invisible, underestimated, was not where I was going to stay. She turned back to look at Jessica, and she made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. I'm going to give you a project, Maya said. It's a real project. Something I've been thinking about but haven't had time to develop. I want you to analyze the structure of our talent development program and identify gaps, areas where we might be missing people like you, bright people who don't fit the standard pipeline. I want you to work on this in addition to your internship duties. You'll report to Carmen, who runs the program. She's going to be expecting you. Jessica's eyes widened. Why are you doing this? Because you had the courage to walk into this office, Maya said. Because you're hungry. Because I see myself in you, and I'm going to make sure that you understand that if you're brave enough and smart enough and willing to do the work, there's no chair in this company that you don't have the right to sit in. Jessica left her office an hour later. They'd talked far longer than 5 minutes, and Maya sat alone again, thinking about cycles and repetition and the weight of using power to change systems while being changed by power itself. Years would pass. Jessica would complete her analysis of the talent development program, would identify crucial gaps that had been invisible to the people running it. She would become a full-time employee, would eventually move into management, would become one of the younger leaders in the organization, and she would carry forward the same principles that Maya had instilled in her. The understanding that talent didn't announce itself through conventional channels, that visibility was something you had to claim, that the table was always big enough if you insisted on expanding it. When Maya retired at 58, younger than Charles Whitmore had, but old enough to step away without feeling unfinished, Jessica was one of the candidates being considered for the CEO position. She didn't get it. The board chose a man named David Chen, who had the right background and the right credentials. But David understood the culture that Maya had built. He understood that profit and purpose weren't mutually exclusive. He understood that the best organizations were the ones that saw all their people, that developed talent wherever it appeared, that treated leadership as a responsibility to build others up, rather than a prize to be hoarded. Maya's last day as CEO was quiet. There was a party in the evening, a formal celebration with the board and the senior leadership team. But in the afternoon, alone in her office, she packed up the things that had accumulated over 9 years. The photographs on the wall, her and her mother at her college graduation, her and Carmen at Carmen's graduation, her and Jessica and a dozen other employees who'd come through the development program, the books on her shelves, the awards and recognitions that she'd never particularly cared about but had accumulated anyway. She left the photograph of herself from college graduation unpacked. That one she was taking home. As she walked through the office for the last time, she passed the boardroom where it had all begun. The long mahogany table was there, the leather chairs, the windows looking out over the city, and for a moment she imagined a young woman in cleaning clothes polishing the surface of that table, wondering if she'd ever belong in a room like this. She would, Maya thought. The system had changed enough that the odds were different now. Not perfect. Nothing was ever perfect. But better, more possible. That was the greatest legacy she could leave. Not the money she'd made for shareholders, not the awards she'd won, not the reputation she'd built. It was the knowledge that the next generation didn't have to be invisible, didn't have to spend years learning the secret language of power, didn't have to question their right to sit at tables where decisions were made. The table had always been big enough. She'd just spent her career making sure everyone understood that.